Helena Ward had always believed that happiness could be grown, much like the roses in her garden. Each morning, she would step out into the crisp air of Cotswold Vale, her wicker basket in hand, and cut the blooms that had opened overnight. The stone cottage she shared with her husband, Thomas, stood proudly on the hill, surrounded by ivy and a sea of flowers. To the villagers, they were the perfect couple, steady, kind, and deeply in love. But beneath the polished surface, something fragile lingered. Thomas had changed over the past months. His eyes, once quick to meet hers, now wandered elsewhere. He left early, returned late, and spoke little. When Helena asked about his long absences, he gave vague answers about contracts and travel. The warmth that once filled their home was cooling, though neither dared to admit it aloud. One afternoon, as Helena tended to the rose bushes by the garden wall, she noticed something odd. The soil beneath one section of the wall had sunk slightly, forming a thin crack that spread along the stones. She knelt and brushed away the dirt, feeling the chill of damp earth. Beneath it lay fragments of what seemed to be old bricks, their edges blackened as though touched by fire. That evening, a letter arrived. It bore no name, only her address written in elegant, unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a single line, written in ink that had bled slightly into the paper. The garden blooms upon the ruins of Betrayal. Helena stared at the words, her heart thudding against her ribs. She showed it to Thomas, but he only frowned, then dismissed it with a half-smile. Someone's idea of a cruel joke, he said before folding the letter and slipping it into the drawer of his desk. Yet that night, Helena could not sleep. She kept thinking about the blackened soil, the cracks beneath the garden walls, and the strange letter that hinted at something buried, not just in the ground, but perhaps in her marriage too. As the wind whispered through the roses outside, she could almost hear the faint sound of something shifting beneath the earth. The following morning, the mist rolled thick over the fields of Cotswold Vale. Helena woke early, long before Thomas stirred. She went out to the garden, her boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The crack beneath the wall had widened overnight. What had once been a thin line was now a jagged opening, and the scent of earth rising from it carried a faint metallic tang, like rust or blood. She fetched a small trowel from the shed and began to dig, careful not to disturb the roots of the roses that clung to the stones. Just a few inches down, the soil gave way to something harder. Helena brushed the dirt aside and froze. A fragment of porcelain lay buried there, the painted cheek of a broken doll, its glassy eye still intact and staring up at her. A chill ran through her spine. She reburied the fragment quickly, feeling foolish, though a strange unease clung to her as she returned to the house. Thomas was at the kitchen table, reading the morning paper, his coffee untouched. "You were out early," he said, glancing up briefly. "Just tending the garden," Helena replied. "The wall seems to be shifting." Thomas folded the paper, his expression tightening. "It's an old house, love. Everything shifts here." But Helena noticed the flicker in his eyes before he turned away. It wasn't indifference, it was fear. That evening, she decided to look for the letter again. She searched the drawer where Thomas had placed it, but it was gone. In its place lay a small, folded photograph. It showed the garden, many years ago, before she and Thomas had moved in. The same wall stood in the background, though newer then, and in the corner of the photograph stood a woman she didn't recognize, her face half turned from the camera, a single rose in her hand. The back of the photo had words scrawled hastily in faded ink. "For tea, when promises meant something." Helena's breath caught. Tea, could it be Thomas? When she asked him that night, he dismissed it at once. "You're imagining things," he said sharply, taking the photo from her hand. It must have belonged to the previous owners. But Helena couldn't forget the look in his eyes, the same haunted flicker she'd seen that morning. Later, when the house was silent and Thomas had gone to bed, she returned to the garden. The air was heavy with the scent of wet soil and roses. The moonlight glinted off the stones of the wall, and for the briefest moment, she thought she heard a whisper, a woman's voice, soft and trembling. Not again. Helena spun around, but the garden was empty. Only the wind moved, sighing through the roses that seemed to shiver in the moonlight. The following days passed in a quiet unease. Helena tried to convince herself that what she had heard in the garden was only the wind, yet the words, "not again," lingered in her mind like a half-forgotten melody. Thomas, on the other hand, grew increasingly distant. He avoided her gaze, spending long hours locked in his study, his voice turning sharp whenever she asked simple questions. On a Thursday afternoon, while Thomas was away, Helena decided to seek answers elsewhere. She walked down the narrow lane into the village and stopped by the small antique shop run by Mrs. Pembrey, an elderly woman who had lived in Cotswold Vale for as long as anyone could remember. When Helena showed her the photograph, Mrs. Pembrey's expression changed at once. Her smile faltered, and her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her spectacles. "Where did you get this, my dear?" she asked softly. "It was in our house," Helena replied. "In a drawer. I think it was taken in our garden, before we moved in." Mrs. Pembrey studied the image for a long time before finally saying, "That would be Lily Morton. A lovely girl, though not without trouble. She lived there with her husband before the fire." Helena's breath caught. "Fire?" The old woman nodded gravely. "A terrible one. Nearly 30 years ago. Some said it was an accident, others whispered it was revenge. Her husband was a builder, worked on the manor houses nearby. There were rumors of an affair, with a married man, no less. The night before she died, she was seen by the garden wall, arguing with someone. No one ever found the man's name." Helena felt her hands grow cold. "Do you know who bought the house after?" "Why, yes. A young couple. Thomas and Helena Ward." Mrs. Pembrey's gaze lingered on her, sharp and knowing. "You might find that house keeps more than just flowers alive." That night, the wind rose again. Thomas came home late, smelling faintly of whiskey. Helena waited for him in the parlor, the photograph laid out on the table. "Who was she, Thomas?" she asked quietly. "Lily Morton." He froze, the color draining from his face. "Where did you hear that name?" "She lived here before us," Helena said. "She died in a fire." "And you were the builder who restored this place, weren't you?" For a long moment, silence filled the room. Then Thomas spoke, his voice rough and low. "I told you never to dig into the past." Helena rose to her feet. "Then tell me the truth. What happened here?" But Thomas only looked towards the darkened window where the roses swayed in the wind and whispered, almost to himself, "Some walls are better left standing, Helena. Even when they're built on graves." Outside, the garden rustled, as though something beneath the soil had begun to stir once more. The following night, rain fell in steady sheets against the windows of the old house. The fire in the hearth burned low, its glow casting restless shadows on the walls. Helena sat alone in the parlor, the silence heavy enough to make her skin crawl. Thomas had gone to his study again, and she could hear the faint sound of drawers opening and closing, papers shuffling, his restless pacing above her. Her thoughts wouldn't rest. The name Lily Morton looped endlessly in her mind. The story Mrs. Pembrey told wouldn't let go either. A fire. A betrayal. A man whose name was never revealed. Helena rose from her chair and climbed the staircase, her hand running along the polished banister. The door to Thomas's study was slightly ajar, and through the crack she could see him standing by his desk, holding the photograph, the one she had shown him. His shoulders were hunched, and his lips moved soundlessly as if speaking to someone unseen. Then he did something that made her blood run cold. He opened the drawer, took out a small silver lighter, and held the photograph above the flame. The edges curled black, and the image of Lily Morton vanished in smoke. "Thomas," Helena whispered, stepping into the room. He spun round, startled. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then Thomas exhaled heavily and sank into his chair. "It was a long time ago," he muttered. "You wouldn't understand." "Try me," she said. He ran a hand through his hair, his eyes hollow. She was the wife of a client. We met when I was restoring this place. She was lonely, desperate. It wasn't supposed to happen, but it did. And then, one night, her husband found out. The fire, it wasn't an accident, Helena. He set it. He locked her in. I tried to reach her, but by the time I did, his voice broke. The house was already in flames. Helena's throat tightened. "And this house? I rebuilt it," Thomas said. "Stone by stone. I thought, if I restored what was lost, maybe I could bury the past too." He looked up at her then, his eyes red-rimmed. "But it followed me here. Every night when the wind howls, I hear her voice. She wants something, Helena. Forgiveness, perhaps. Or justice." Before Helena could reply, a low groan echoed through the house, a deep, twisting sound like wood splitting under pressure. The lamp on Thomas's desk flickered. Then the wind outside rose, and a sudden crash sounded from below. They rushed downstairs to find the parlor window blown open, rain lashing in. The scent of smoke drifted through the air, faint but unmistakable. "The fire," Thomas whispered. "It's happening again." Helena turned toward the garden, her breath trembling. Out there, through the blur of rain, a pale figure stood by the cracked wall, her dress rippling in the storm. Lily Morton. Her eyes glowed with sorrow and fury alike. The night had fallen thick over the Stafford home, the kind of darkness that pressed against the windows like a living thing. Evelyn could not sleep. She kept thinking of the mysterious call, of the perfume, of the stranger's name her husband had spoken in his sleep. Unable to bear the suffocating silence of the bedroom, she rose, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and wandered through the dimly lit corridors. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet, the air carrying the faint smell of polished wood and cold tea. When she reached the conservatory, she froze. The door was ajar. A soft, feminine voice drifted out, a whisper, barely audible, yet heavy with emotion. Evelyn's heart thudded. She pressed herself against the wall, listening. "James, you promised you'd tell her." Her breath caught in her throat. That voice, it wasn't familiar, yet it carried something intimate, something that didn't belong in her home. She peeked through the gap. Inside, James stood with his back to her, facing a shadowed figure seated near the glass. A woman, her features hidden by the dim light, her posture fragile yet defiant. "I said I would handle it," James muttered. "Not now. Not like this." The woman's voice trembled, but her words were sharp. "You said that last time. I won't live in the dark anymore, James. She deserves to know who I am." Evelyn stumbled back, her pulse roaring in her ears. "Who I am." The words struck her like a blade. She turned and fled, her shawl catching on the corner of a table as she ran up the stairs, her mind spinning. By the time she reached her room, her hands were shaking so violently she could barely light the bedside lamp. James's voice downstairs rose briefly, muffled by walls and distance. Then silence again. Moments later, the front door slammed. James did not come to bed that night. Evelyn sat awake until dawn, staring at the window as the first light crept over the village rooftops. In that pale glow, she saw something she had never noticed before, a small envelope wedged behind the clock on the mantel. Her trembling fingers pulled it free. Her name was written across it in her husband's handwriting. But the postmark on the back bore a date from 6 years ago, the year before they were married. And the sender's name, in a graceful hand, was Margaret Ashcroft. A name Evelyn had never heard before. But one she would soon wish she had never found at all. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the envelope as though it was something poisonous. The morning light glinted faintly on the wax seal, a dull red circle pressed with the initial M. Her hands trembled as she broke it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed slightly with time. The handwriting was elegant, deliberate, a woman's hand, full of feeling and restraint. Evelyn began to read. My dearest James. By the time you read this, I will be far from Bath. I cannot bear the shame that has settled over us. You must understand, what we shared cannot survive the truth that has now come to light. But know that what I carry with me is yours. Entirely yours. Evelyn's breath caught. What I carry with me. The words struck her like ice. The letter continued, the tone both sorrowful and pleading. You must not come after me. For your sake, and for hers, the child must never know your name. I will not ruin the life you have yet to build. But promise me, James, you will not forget us entirely. Her fingers went numb. The paper slipped slightly from her grasp. A child. There was a child. She read the letter again and again, as if repetition might change its meaning. But the truth was clear. Before her marriage, before their life together, James had loved another woman, and she had borne his child. Evelyn's world began to tilt. The sound of the clock ticking grew unbearably loud. Downstairs, the front door creaked open. Footsteps, slow, hesitant. James had returned. Evelyn quickly folded the letter and slipped it beneath her pillow. When James entered the room, his face was drawn, his collar undone, his eyes dark with exhaustion. Where were you? She asked quietly. He hesitated. Walking. Thinking. Alone. The silence that followed was long and suffocating. Then James nodded once, though his gaze drifted away from hers. Evelyn wanted to confront him, to thrust the letter in his face, demand answers, scream until the walls echoed her pain. But something stopped her. A cold, trembling instinct. If he had hidden this from her for so many years, what else might he hide? That night, she did not sleep beside him. She lay still, eyes open, the faint outline of the envelope beneath her pillow pressing against her skin like a secret heartbeat. By morning, her decision was made. She would find Margaret Ashcroft. And she would find out what kind of child her husband had abandoned. 2 days later, Evelyn arrived at a small village near Bristol called Ashcombe Vale. The morning mist clung to the hills like a veil, and the road wound between hedgerows heavy with dew. In her gloved hand, she carried the letter, the only clue that had led her here. She had traced the name Margaret Ashcroft through old records at the town hall, and one address had stood out, Ashcroft Cottage, near the parish church. It was a modest home, overgrown with ivy, its windows curtained and still. Evelyn hesitated at the gate. Then she knocked. The door opened a moment later, revealing a woman in her late 50s, with grey streaks in her dark hair and eyes the colour of storm clouds. She studied Evelyn silently before speaking. You must be Mrs. Ward, she said softly, as if she had been expecting her. Evelyn froze. You know who I am? A faint smile. I recognized your handwriting. You wrote to the parish, asking about me. It's not the first time someone has come searching for the past. Margaret stepped aside and gestured her in. The cottage smelled faintly of lavender and dust. On the mantelpiece stood a small portrait, a young woman holding a child, both painted with astonishing care. Evelyn felt her throat tighten. Is that you? She asked. Margaret nodded. And my daughter, Lillian. Evelyn's pulse raced. Where is she now? Margaret's expression grew guarded. She lives near the coast. She's a music teacher. She knows nothing of her father's name, and that's how it must remain. The air thickened between them. Evelyn felt her composure slipping. His name was James Ward, she whispered. He was my husband. Margaret's face went pale, though her eyes did not widen in surprise, only in a deep, tired understanding. She sank into a chair, hands trembling slightly. "So," she murmured, "the truth has finally reached your doorstep." Evelyn sat opposite her, heart pounding. "Why did you write to him? Why now?" "I didn't," said Margaret quietly. "I burned my last letter to him 30 years ago. If a message has found you, it wasn't from my hand." Evelyn blinked. "But the seal, the handwriting." Margaret rose and walked to the old piano in the corner. She ran a finger along the keys, her touch hesitant. James was the only man who ever played this piano. After he left, sometimes, it played itself. Softly, on stormy nights. "My daughter said it was just the wind, but I knew better." Her voice trembled. "I always believed that when it finally stopped, it would mean his soul had found peace. But if the music has begun again..." Evelyn's heart began to hammer. "It has," she said. "Every night since I found that letter." Margaret turned to her, eyes glistening. "Then something unfinished remains between us all." The wind outside began to rise, rattling the windows. Evelyn felt an inexplicable chill sweep through the room. On the piano, a single key pressed down, by no visible hand, and a low, haunting note filled the air. Both women stared in horror as the note lingered, quivering, as if the instrument itself had remembered their shared sin. Margaret whispered, "He's not gone." Evelyn could only whisper back, "No. He's come home." That evening, Evelyn returned to the Stafford house, the air heavy with impending rain. She felt the letter from Margaret burning in her pocket, a reminder of secrets too long buried. The moment she stepped through the front door, the house seemed to sigh, a low, restless sound that echoed in the hallway. James was sitting by the fire, his hands clasped, eyes staring into the flames. The room smelled faintly of wet earth, as if the garden outside had crept in. "I need to tell you everything," he said quietly before Evelyn could speak. She sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap. "Start from the beginning." He exhaled, a shudder running through his shoulders. "Margaret, we met before I ever knew you. She was young, lost, and alone. I loved her. I wanted to protect her. And then," he paused, voice breaking. "Then she had Lillian. A child I never told you about. I tried to forget. I tried to move on. I never imagined the past would reach us like this." Evelyn felt her chest tighten. The weight of his words pressed down on her like a storm cloud. "And you never told me," she whispered. "I was afraid," James admitted. "Afraid of losing you. Afraid the truth would destroy everything. I thought if I buried it, it could stay buried. But the past, it has a way of returning." Outside, the wind rose to a howl. Rain lashed against the windows, rattling the panes. And then the piano in the corner played a note, low and quivering, as if urging them both to listen. Evelyn stood. "We cannot ignore it anymore. We must face it, all of it." James rose too, reaching for her hand. "I'm ready," he said. "If you are." The storm raged around the house, but inside, Evelyn felt something shift, a fragile thread of understanding, a bridge between past and present. Together, they would seek Margaret, confront the truth, and finally decide what would become of the family James had never fully revealed. The piano played again, more boldly now, each note like a heartbeat marking the beginning of a reckoning. Outside, the wind howled, the rain fell, and the truth, long buried, was finally awake.